You think your pathetic little weeds are worth $67,000? You're insane. I'm going to have you committed. That was the first thing Carol said to me after I handed her the certified letter. Not hello. Not what is this? Just a screech that threatened to shatter the glass in her perfectly sterile, HOA-approved front door. It was a fair question, I suppose. To an outside observer, $67,452.18 might seem like a steep price for a few wilted tomato plants and some scorched zucchini vines. But it was never about the vegetables. It was about the scorched earth she had declared on my life, and the bedrock of sanity she was trying to poison. This whole mess started because I wanted to be left alone. After my wife, Eleanor, passed away, the house felt cavernous, each room an echo chamber for memories. The only place I found any semblance of peace was in her garden. Eleanor had been a master gardener, a soil whisperer. She believed dirt was honest. You give it care, you respect its composition, and it gives you life. Our backyard wasn't some manicured showpiece, it was a living, breathing, chaotic testament to that belief. It was an ecosystem, certified organic for the last 10 years, a designation we'd worked on together and were immensely proud of. After she was gone, tending to that plot of land was the only way I could still feel connected to her. I was a retired soil scientist, so I knew the technical side of it, the nitrogen cycles, the pH balances, the delicate dance of microbes. But Eleanor had taught me the art. That garden was our shared legacy, a half-acre of life in a world that had suddenly gone quiet and gray. Our neighborhood, Maple Creek Estates, was the physical opposite of that garden. It was a place of relentless conformity. Every lawn was cut to the same height, every mailbox was the identical shade of beige, and every shrub was pruned into a perfect, soulless sphere. It was a community governed by a thick binder of rules designed to sand down any rough edges of personality. And the woman holding the sandpaper was Carol. Carol was the president of our homeowners association, a title she wore like a military general. She was a woman whose entire identity seemed to be constructed from a foundation of petty grievances and a lust for absolute control. She patrolled the sidewalks in her golf cart, a clipboard permanently affixed to her hand, her eyes scanning for infractions like a hawk searching for field mice. A misplaced garden hose, a trash can left out an hour too long, a flag flown on a non-approved holiday, these were the battles that gave her life meaning. For the first year after Eleanor's death, she'd left me alone, probably out of some grudging respect for my grief. But my grace period had apparently expired. The inciting incident, the first tremor before the earthquake, was a pale yellow envelope stuck to my front door with an aggressive amount of tape. Inside was an official violation notice. The infraction. Unkempt and aesthetically displeasing vegetation, it came with a $50 fine. I stared at the words. Aesthetically displeasing. She was talking about Eleanor's garden. She was talking about the sprawling heirloom tomato vines, the robust kale that grew in beautiful, fractal patterns, the milkweed we planted for the monarchs. To her, it was just a mess that didn't conform to the neighborhood's sterile green carpet. I walked to the back window and looked out at the garden. It was a riot of life. Bees buzzed around the borage flowers, the sweet corn was tasseling, and the sunflowers stood like tall, cheerful sentinels along the back fence. It wasn't tidy in the way Carol understood the word, but it was healthy, productive, and beautiful. It was ours. My first instinct was to just pay the fine. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to tend my plants and nurse my quiet sorrow. But then I imagined Eleanor's reaction. She would have laughed, then she would have marched right over to Carol's house with a basket of fresh-picked, aesthetically displeasing tomatoes and given her a lecture on biodiversity. The thought made me smile for the first time in days. So, instead of writing a check, I wrote a letter. I calmly and politely quoted the section of the HOA bylaws that specifically allowed for vegetable gardens, provided they were maintained and free of pests. I pointed out that my garden was not only maintained but was a registered, certified organic plot, which exceeded any reasonable standard of care. I enclosed a copy of our organic certification and mailed it to the HOA board. I didn't expect an apology, but I did expect the matter to be dropped. That was my first mistake. I had tried to reason with an unreasonable person. I had presented a logical argument to a creature of pure, irrational authority. Carol didn't see my letter as a clarification, she saw it as a challenge. She saw it as a peasant questioning the divine right of a queen. And that's when she began to escalate. The violation notices started coming weekly. My compost bin, which had been in the same spot for 15 years, was suddenly a noxious odor source. The rainwater barrels Eleanor and I had installed were cited as unapproved structural modifications. She even fined me for the excessive buzzing of the bees I kept, claiming they constituted a public nuisance. Each notice was a paper cut, a small annoyance designed to wear me down. I responded to each one with the same dispassionate calm, citing the relevant bylaws, providing documentation, and refusing to pay the illegitimate fines. With every letter I sent, I could feel her rage simmering just below the surface of her officious, bureaucratic language. She wasn't used to being challenged, and she certainly wasn't used to being challenged with facts. Her harassment moved from the official to the personal. She started taking pictures of my property from the sidewalk, her phone held up in a comically conspicuous way. She would stand there for minutes, documenting my every move. If I was out watering, she'd be there, watching. If I was weeding, she'd be there, scowling. It was a war of attrition. Then came the community newsletter. In her President's Corner column, she wrote a thinly veiled diatribe about certain residents who refused to adhere to community standards and whose unsightly properties were driving down property values for everyone. She mentioned the importance of a cohesive aesthetic and warned that rogue elements could threaten the very fabric of our beautiful neighborhood. My neighbors, for the most part, were decent people who just wanted to avoid trouble. A few of them gave me sympathetic looks, but no one wanted to end up on Carol's clipboard. They saw her for what she was, a petty tyrant, but it was easier to keep your lawn perfectly manicured and stay off her radar. I was becoming a pariah, the crazy old man with the messy garden. I continued to ignore her, focusing my energy on the soil. I was harvesting the first of the summer squash, and the tomatoes were just beginning to blush. The work was therapeutic. It was a routine that kept the grief from completely swallowing me whole. I was determined not to let her poison my sanctuary. I had no idea how literally she would take that thought. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning. I walked out with my coffee, just as the sun was beginning to burn off the morning dew. The air usually smelled of damp earth and chlorophyll. That morning, it smelled wrong. There was a sharp, chemical tang hanging in the air, an acrid scent that had no place in an organic garden. My stomach clenched. I walked toward the vegetable beds along the side of my house, the ones closest to the property line I shared with an empty lot Carol had to pass on her morning patrol. It was a massacre. The broad leaves of my zucchini and cucumber plants were yellowed and wilted, looking as if they'd been boiled. The lower leaves of my prized tomato plants, the Brandywine heirlooms Eleanor had babied from seed, were scorched and curling inward. A wide, 10-foot swath of my garden was dying. It was a clear, deliberate line of destruction. The ground was darker there, still damp with whatever chemical cocktail had been sprayed on it. I stood there, coffee mug forgotten in my hand, and felt a cold, hard rage solidify in my chest. This was no longer about bylaws or aesthetics. This was a physical assault. She had crossed a line from petty harassment into actual, malicious destruction. She had trespassed on my property and deliberately poisoned the last living piece of my wife I had left. The piece I had been so desperately clinging to shattered. My desire to be left alone was incinerated by the chemical burn on those leaves. I had been patient. I had been logical. I had been civil. Now, that was over. She wanted a war. Fine. But I wasn't going to fight her on her turf of gossip and fines. I was a scientist. I was going to bring this battle into my world. A world of evidence, data, and consequences. I went back inside, not in a panic, but with a chilling, methodical calm. I pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves and grabbed my soil sampling kit. I took samples from the affected area, the unaffected area, and a control sample from the front yard. I labeled each one with a grease pencil, noting the date, time, and exact location. I took dozens of high-resolution photos of the damage from every conceivable angle. I knew exactly what I was looking for. The damage was characteristic of a broad-spectrum, non-selective herbicide, likely something with a high concentration of glyphosate mixed with a surfactant to make it stick to the leaves. It was the kind of stuff you used to kill everything on a gravel driveway, not something you'd ever find within 100 yards of a certified organic garden. My mind was already working, the gears of my old professional life grinding back into motion. This wasn't just vandalism anymore. This was a direct violation of federal organic standards. My certification wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a legally binding status that required years of soil remediation and adherence to draconian rules. She hadn't just killed a few plants, she had contaminated my land. She had, in effect, destroyed my entire operation for the foreseeable future. The first phase of my investigation was simple evidence gathering. I sent the soil samples off to a trusted lab I'd worked with for years, requesting a full toxicology screen. I knew it would cost a few $100s, but I considered it an investment. The second phase was surveillance. Carol was arrogant. She believed she was untouchable. She'd gotten away with this once, and if I didn't react publicly, she'd probably assume her chemical warfare had worked. I needed to catch her if she came back. I spent the afternoon installing a series of high-end security cameras. They were small, weatherproof, and had night vision and motion detection. I wasn't some tech genius, but I was methodical. I placed one camera disguised as a birdhouse, aimed directly at the damaged section of the garden. I put another in a decorative lawn gnome, covering the path from the sidewalk. A third went up high on the eaves of the house, giving a wide-angle view of the entire backyard and the property line. I linked them all to a dedicated hard drive in my office. Any motion would be recorded in crisp, 4K resolution. The third phase was research. I went down to the county records office. I pulled the HOA's articles of incorporation, the meeting minutes for the last 5 years, and, most importantly, their annual budgets and expense reports. I spent hours poring over the documents, my coffee getting cold next to me. For the first few hours, it was all boilerplate and mundane expenses. Lawn care, pool maintenance, insurance. But then I found it. A line item under grounds maintenance that seemed disproportionately large. A company called Evergreen Landscaping Solutions was being paid a staggering amount of money for weed and pest abatement services. The fees were nearly double what they should have been for a community our size. The name sounded vaguely familiar. A quick search on my phone confirmed my suspicion. The owner and operator of Evergreen Landscaping Solutions was a man named Frank Gibbons. I recognized the last name. Carol's maiden name was Gibbons. A little more digging on social media revealed the connection. Frank was her brother-in-law. My heart started beating a little faster. This wasn't just a vendetta against my garden anymore. This was a pattern. This was about money. I kept digging. I cross-referenced the invoices from Evergreen with the HOA's own environmental guidelines, which I had quoted in my letters to her. The guidelines explicitly restricted the use of certain chemical herbicides and pesticides within the community to protect the small creek that ran along the edge of the property. The very chemicals I suspected she'd used on my garden were on that restricted list. She wasn't just breaking the rules. She was paying her own family a premium to do it, using community funds. The whole, cohesive aesthetic she preached was a smokescreen. Her crusade for perfect green lawns was a front for a kickback scheme. My messy, organic garden wasn't just an eyesore to her, it was a philosophical threat to her profitable chemical-dependent regime. The lab results came back 3 days later. It was exactly what I expected, only worse. The soil was heavily contaminated with glyphosate and diquat, a nasty combination designed for fast, total vegetation kill. The levels were so high that the lab technician had called me personally, asking if there had been an industrial spill. He confirmed that it would take a minimum of 3 years of intensive soil remediation, chelation, cover cropping, and repeated testing, before the land could even be considered for organic recertification. I had everything I needed. The evidence of the crime, the financial motive, and a trap waiting to be sprung. Carol thought she was fighting a war over lawn clippings and property values. She had no idea I was about to change the battlefield to one of fraud, conspiracy, and federal environmental regulations. Now, it was time to formulate my plan. It couldn't be a simple, angry confrontation. That's what she would expect. My revenge had to be as meticulous and undeniable as a scientific proof. It had to be poetic. She had attacked my garden, my business, my connection to my wife, so I would respond not as a disgruntled neighbor, but as a professional whose enterprise had been sabotaged. I spent the next 2 days in my office, which was now my war room. I didn't just want to win, I wanted to dismantle her. I wanted to use the very rules and regulations she wielded as weapons against everyone else and turn them back on her with crushing force. My plan had 3 distinct phases: the bill, the bait, and the board. Phase 1 was the bill. This was the centerpiece of my strategy. I wasn't going to sue her, not yet. I was going to treat this as a simple matter of commercial damages. I opened a spreadsheet and began to calculate the true cost of her little act of vandalism. This was my world, and I knew every variable. First, the direct losses. I itemized the cost of the destroyed plants, the seeds, the organic compost I'd worked into the soil for years. That was the small part. Next, the cost of remediation. I got a formal quote from an environmental cleanup company for the removal and replacement of the top 18 inches of contaminated soil in the affected area. The price was astronomical. Then I added the cost of 3 years of mandatory soil testing to prove the absence of chemical residues, a requirement for recertification. Then came the biggest number: loss of income. I had a small but profitable side business selling my organic produce to a couple of high-end local restaurants. They paid a premium for certified, heirloom varieties. I had contracts and past invoices. I calculated the projected loss of revenue for the 3 years my land would be fallow. I added the cost of reapplying for organic certification once the remediation was complete. Finally, I added a line item for my own time, billing my services as a soil remediation consultant at my old professional rate. After all, I would be the one overseeing the entire process. When I hit sum on the spreadsheet, the number that appeared made me blink. $67,452.18. It was an absurd figure, but it was also meticulously documented, legally sound, and completely defensible. Every single cent was justified. I typed it all up into a formal invoice, addressed to Carol Peterson, in her personal capacity. I attached copies of the lab report, the remediation quote, my organic certification, and my sales invoices from the restaurants. I printed it on heavy bond paper and put it in a crisp business envelope. This wasn't a nasty letter, it was a professional demand for payment. Phase 2 was the bait. I knew she wouldn't just pay the bill. She would explode. Her arrogance was her weakness, and I was going to exploit it. I needed her to incriminate herself further, this time on camera. I went to a specialty nursery and bought 3 of the most delicate, expensive plants I could find: a rare, variegated Monstera albo, a tiny Japanese maple, and a black truffle sapling inoculated with spores. They were ridiculously overpriced and completely unsuited for outdoor life in our climate. But they looked expensive. I planted them right in the center of the damaged area, in freshly turned, clean soil I'd brought in bags. I made a big show of it, working out in the open all Saturday afternoon. I even put up a little sign that read, "New remediation project, please do not disturb." It was a red flag to a bull. I was practically daring her to finish the job. I checked the cameras, made sure the batteries were fresh and the hard drive was empty and waiting. Phase 3 was the board. The final confrontation couldn't happen in private. It had to be public. It had to be in front of the very people she lorded her power over. The next monthly HOA meeting was in 10 days. That would be my stage. With the plan in place, all I had to do was wait. I mailed the invoice via certified mail with a return receipt requested. The little green card would be my proof that she had received it. The trap was set. The bait was out. The cameras were rolling. The certified mail receipt came back signed 3 days later. The silence from her house was deafening. I knew she was stewing. I could almost feel the waves of her fury radiating across the neighborhood. She was probably talking to her lawyer, who was probably telling her to ignore it as the ramblings of a crazy person. But Carol wasn't the type to ignore a challenge. Her ego wouldn't allow it. The waiting was the hardest part. I watched the camera feeds on my computer, a knot of anticipation tightening in my gut. For 2 days, nothing. Just squirrels and the mailman. I started to wonder if I had misjudged her. Maybe she was smarter than I thought. Maybe she would just let the lawyers handle it. Then, on the 3rd night, it happened. It was just after 2 a.m. My motion sensor alert pinged on my phone. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the live feed from the camera disguised as a birdhouse. The night vision was crystal clear. A figure dressed in dark clothing was creeping along the edge of my property. It was her. She was carrying a backpack sprayer, the kind used for pesticides. She moved with a furtive, guilty energy that was almost comical. She clearly thought she was invisible in the dark. She stopped right in front of my new, expensive plants. The camera was only 10 feet away, the audio receiver sharp enough to pick up the crickets chirping. She muttered to herself, and the microphone picked it up perfectly. "Remediation project, my ass," she hissed. "I'll give you something to remediate, you crazy old fool." She unslung the sprayer, pumped the handle a few times, and then drenched my new plants with a stream of liquid. She sprayed the ground all around them for good measure, a scornful, triumphant look on her face, illuminated in the eerie green glow of the night vision. It was more than I could have hoped for. It was a monologue. It was a confession. It was a perfect, self-contained piece of evidence, delivered by the perpetrator herself. She scurried away as quickly as she had come. I watched her go, then saved the video file to 3 separate hard drives and uploaded a copy to a secure cloud server. I felt a grim, cold satisfaction wash over me. The trap had sprung. She had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. The next 7 days leading up to the HOA meeting were quiet. I didn't react to the new damage. I left the dead, chemically burned plants right where they were, a silent testament to her crime. I imagined her watching my house, waiting for a reaction, and getting nothing. It must have driven her crazy. The night of the HOA meeting, I put on a fresh shirt and a tie, something I hadn't done in years. I felt like a lawyer preparing for a trial. I had a slim briefcase with me. Inside was a folder containing the invoice, the lab reports, the certified mail receipt, and a printed, notarized transcript of the audio from the video. I also had a small, powerful projector and my laptop. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights that buzzed with an annoying frequency. About 30 residents were there, most looking bored, expecting the usual arguments over pool hours and parking violations. Carol sat at the head table with the other 2 board members, a timid accountant named Barry and a woman who seemed to be permanently attached to her phone. Carol ran the meeting like a dictator, banging her gavel and shutting down any discussion she didn't like. I waited patiently through the treasurer's report and the landscaping committee update. The landscaping update was particularly galling. Carol's brother-in-law's company was praised for its diligent efforts in maintaining our community's beauty. I had to clench my jaw to keep from laughing out loud. Finally, Carol opened the floor for new business. This was my moment. I stood up. "Madam President," I said, my voice calm and even. "I have a new business item to discuss. It concerns a matter of property damage and a pending financial claim." Carol's eyes narrowed. She gave me a look of pure venom. "Mr. Miller, if this is about your frivolous fines, this is not the proper forum. You can submit your complaints in writing." "Actually, it's not about the fines," I said, walking slowly toward the front of the room. "It's about an invoice for $67,452.18 that I sent to you, personally, via certified mail last week. I have the receipt here confirming you received it." A murmur went through the room. People sat up a little straighter. Carol's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. "That is a private matter, and it is completely insane. You are out of order." "I don't think it is a private matter," I continued, my voice never rising. "Because it concerns the deliberate destruction of private property within our community, using chemicals that are explicitly forbidden by the HOA's own environmental guidelines. The same guidelines your preferred landscaping contractor, Evergreen Solutions, also seems to be violating on a regular basis, at great expense to the homeowners." The accountant, Barry, looked up, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "This is slander." Carol shrieked, banging her gavel. "You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," I said softly. I opened my briefcase and took out the folder. "Proof is my specialty, Carol. For instance, I have this report from a certified laboratory detailing the exact chemical composition of the poison used on my property. A poison, I might add, that has rendered a portion of my land commercially unviable for a minimum of 3 years." I placed the lab report on the table in front of her. She stared at it as if it were a snake. "This proves nothing," she sputtered. "Anyone could have done that." "That's true," I conceded. It was dark, after all. Around 2:14 a.m., to be precise. It would be hard to identify someone in the dark. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Unless, of course, I said, pulling the small projector from my briefcase and setting it on the table, you had a very, very good night vision camera. The color drained from Carol's face. For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear appeared in her eyes. She finally understood that this wasn't just an argument. This was an execution. But I wasn't going to show the video. Not yet. That was my trump card. This was just the first reveal, designed to make her lose her composure. And it was working perfectly. "You are harassing me," she yelled, her voice cracking. "This is a violation of my privacy. I am the president of this board, and I will not be intimidated by a lunatic who thinks his weeds are made of gold." She was spiraling, just as I'd predicted. Her denial was too loud, her rage too performative. The other residents were watching the exchange like a tennis match, their expressions shifting from boredom to fascination. They could smell blood in the water. "I'm not intimidating you, Carol," I said, my voice still quiet and reasonable. "I'm simply presenting the preliminary evidence for my financial claim. A claim you have chosen to ignore. The next step will be a civil suit, which will, of course, involve depositions and subpoenas. For instance, subpoenas for the HOA's financial records, and the invoices from your brother-in-law's company." Barry, the accountant, suddenly looked very pale. He knew about the financials. He had to know they were inflated. Carol shot him a look that could curdle milk, a silent threat to keep his mouth shut. She then turned her fury back on me. "Get out," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "You are no longer recognized. This meeting is adjourned." She slammed her gavel down so hard it bounced off the table. She gathered her papers and stormed out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. I had won the battle, but the war was far from over. I had publicly humiliated her and exposed her vulnerability. A cornered animal is a dangerous animal, and I knew Carol wouldn't just retreat. She would retaliate, and it would be vicious. I had to be ready. Carol's retaliation was swifter and more brutal than I could have imagined. She didn't bother with HOA fines anymore. She went for the jugular. She launched a scorched earth campaign designed to destroy my reputation and drive me out of the neighborhood. The first salvo was fired on the community's private Facebook group. Overnight, a long post from Carol appeared. It was a masterpiece of manipulative, defamatory prose. She painted me as a mentally unstable, vindictive old man who was harassing her because of legitimate concerns about property standards. She claimed I was running an illegal, unregulated farm in my backyard, using dangerous and unsanitary practices like composting, which she implied was attracting vermin to the neighborhood. But then she took a darker turn. She hinted that my erratic behavior was a danger to the community's children. She never said it outright, but the insinuation was there, hanging in the air like a foul poison. "We must protect our families from unstable elements," she wrote. It was a classic smear tactic, designed to isolate me and turn public opinion against me through fear. The comments section exploded. Some people defended me, but many more, whipped into a frenzy by her post, piled on. I was called a creep, a menace, a lawsuit-happy crank. My quiet life was being publicly dismantled, one nasty comment at a time. The online attack was followed by a real-world one. A few days later, a truck from the city's code enforcement department pulled up to my house. A weary-looking inspector informed me that he had received an anonymous complaint about multiple health and safety violations on my property. I spent the next 2 hours walking him through my garden. He checked my compost bin, perfectly maintained, my rainwater barrels, properly screened against mosquitoes, and the structural integrity of my small greenhouse, rock solid. He was professional and courteous, and it was clear he knew this was a harassment call. "Everything seems to be in perfect order, Mr. Miller," he said as he was leaving. "Frankly, this is one of the cleanest and best-maintained properties I've seen all month." The complainant mentioned something about illegal commercial activity. "I sell some vegetables to a couple of local restaurants," I admitted. "I have a business license and pay my taxes. It's all above board." He nodded, a look of understanding on his face. "We get these kinds of calls all the time. Neighbor disputes. You take care, sir. Carol's official attempts to get me in trouble were failing. Her weapons were bouncing off my shields of meticulous documentation and adherence to the rules. But the social pressure was mounting. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away. I was being ostracized, just as she intended. She was digging her grave deeper with every lie, but she was also trying to pull me into it with her. I knew I couldn't wait for the civil suit to play out. That would take months, even years. I needed something to end this now. I needed the final, undeniable proof that would not just discredit her, but remove her from power entirely. My video was damning for the vandalism, but I needed the smoking gun for the fraud. And then, like a miracle, it fell right into my lap. I got an email from an anonymous, encrypted address. The subject line was just one word: evergreen. The body of the email was short and to the point. I used to be the bookkeeper for Frank Gibbons. He and his sister-in-law, Carol, have been defrauding the Maple Creek HOA for years. I have proof. Invoices, emails, bank statements. I was fired for asking too many questions. If you can guarantee my anonymity, I will give you everything. My hands were shaking as I typed a reply. I told the sender I was very interested and that I could absolutely protect their identity. We arranged a time and place to meet, a crowded coffee shop in the next town over. The whistleblower was a woman in her late 50s named Brenda. She was nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder, but she also had a core of steely resolve. She told me her story. She had worked for Frank for 5 years. She'd always known he was overcharging the HOA, but she'd kept her mouth shut. But in the last year, it had escalated from simple overbilling to outright fraud. They started billing for services never rendered, she explained, pushing a thick manila envelope across the table. They'd bill for chemical fertilizer applications on days it was pouring rain. They billed for planting dozens of trees that were never purchased. Carol would approve the invoices, the HOA would pay, and she and Frank would split the overage. It's tens of thousands of dollars, at least. She told me Frank had fired her 2 weeks ago after she confronted him about a particularly blatant fake invoice. She'd been scared to come forward, but then she'd heard through the grapevine about my public confrontation with Carol at the HOA meeting. She saw a chance for justice. She's a bully, Brenda said, her voice filled with a quiet anger. Her and Frank, they think they're untouchable. It's time someone showed them they aren't. I opened the envelope. It was all there. Copies of the fraudulent invoices, with Brenda's notes in the margins. Printed emails between Carol and Frank, discussing how to pad the bills and which projects to invent. Just add another $10K for aeration services, no one will ever check, one of Carol's emails read. It was a complete, self-contained portrait of a criminal conspiracy. I now had irrefutable proof of multiple felonies, criminal damage to property, conspiracy, and felony fraud. This was no longer an HOA matter. This was way beyond a civil suit. This was a job for the district attorney. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer I knew, a sharp guy who specialized in white-collar crime. I wanted to make sure I handled the evidence correctly. The second call, on his advice, was to the non-emergency line of the police department. I told the desk sergeant I needed to report evidence of ongoing felony fraud and property crimes. 2 detectives came to my house that afternoon. They were skeptical at first, probably expecting another cranky neighbor dispute. I sat them down at my dining room table and laid it all out, piece by piece, in chronological order. I started with the first fine. I showed them the pictures of the initial damage to my garden, the lab report, and the $67,000 invoice. Then, I played them the video. As the grainy, green-lit footage of Carol played on my laptop, their expressions changed from professional detachment to rapt attention. When she delivered her line about giving me something to remediate, one of the detectives let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, "that's about as clear as it gets." "There's more," I said, and pushed Brenda's manila envelope across the table. "This is evidence of a systematic fraud scheme against the homeowners of this community, perpetrated by the HOA president and her brother-in-law." They spent the next hour going through the documents, their faces growing more serious with each page. They took copious notes. When they were done, they looked at me with a newfound respect. "Mr. Miller," the senior detective said, "you've done some incredible work here. This is one of the most well-documented civilian cases I've ever seen. You've basically done our job for us. They took all my evidence, the video, the documents, a copy of my hard drive, bagging it and tagging it officially. They assured me they would be opening a full investigation and that the district attorney's office would be very interested. Before they left, I asked them for one thing. Is it possible to coordinate the timing of any action you might take? I believe the community deserves to see this resolved publicly. The detective grinned. I think we can arrange that. The final showdown was set. Some of my neighbors, emboldened by my stand at the last meeting and disgusted by Carol's smear campaign, had successfully petitioned for a special emergency meeting of the HOA. The official topic was a vote of no confidence in President Peterson. Everyone knew it was going to be a dramatic confrontation. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday. I made sure the detectives knew the time and place. The clubhouse was packed. It was standing room only. Word had gotten out that this was going to be a spectacle. Carol was there, sitting at the head table, looking smug and defiant. She had her brother-in-law, Frank, with her for support. They were both radiating an aura of arrogant impunity, clearly believing this was a pathetic little rebellion they could easily crush. The meeting began, and one of my neighbors, a retired teacher named George, stood up and read the motion for the vote of no confidence, citing Carol's divisive leadership and a pattern of harassment against residents. Carol let him finish, then stood up, a condescending smile on her face. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "A little petition because some of you don't like the rules. I am this community's duly elected president. This little temper tantrum is meaningless." She then launched into a speech, portraying herself as the victim, the tireless volunteer working to protect their property values from destructive elements like Mr. Miller and his supporters. I let her talk. I let her dig her own grave a little deeper. When she was finally finished, I stood up. The room went silent. "Carol," I began, my voice carrying easily in the quiet room, "we've already established that you're a vandal. We've established that you're a liar. Now, I think it's time we all learned that you're also a thief." Frank shot to his feet. "You can't talk to her like that." "Sit down, Frank," I said, not even looking at him. "Your turn is coming." I turned to the assembled homeowners. "For the last 5 years," I said, "our HOA president and her brother-in-law have been systematically defrauding this community. They have been billing us for services never rendered and padding invoices for their own personal enrichment. They have stolen tens of thousands of dollars of our money. Your money." I had printed out copies of the most damning emails and invoices from Brenda's file. I began to pass them out to the people in the front rows. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd as people saw the proof in black and white. Carol's face had gone from smug to ashen. "Those are forgeries. He's a desperate man, making up lies." "Are they, Carol?" I asked calmly. "Then I suppose this is a forgery too." This was the moment. I turned on the projector, which I had already set up. I aimed it at the large, blank wall behind the head table. And I hit play. The video started. The dark, green-lit image of my garden filled the wall. The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of crickets chirping from my laptop speakers. Then, Carol crept into the frame. A collective gasp went through the room. We all watched as the president of our homeowners association, in the dead of night, maliciously poisoned my property. We all heard her hiss, "I'll give you something to remediate, you crazy old fool." When the video ended, I switched off the projector. The silence in the room was absolute. No one was looking at me. Every single eye was fixed on Carol. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and panic. She was trapped, exposed, and utterly defeated. And like a cornered rat, she lashed out. "He drove me to it," she shrieked, her voice a raw, hysterical screech. "He wouldn't follow the rules. He deserved it. He deserved everything he got. I did it for this community. To protect our standards." It was a full confession, screamed in a room full of witnesses. And right on cue, the two detectives, who had been waiting discreetly in the hallway, stepped into the room. Carol Peterson, the senior detective said, his voice calm but firm, "You're under arrest for criminal damage to property." "Frank Gibbons, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud." The room erupted. Carol had a complete public meltdown. She screamed, she cried, she accused the detectives of being part of my conspiracy against her. Frank just stood there, his face slack with shock, as the other detective put him in handcuffs. As they led Carol away, she made one last, desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of power. She twisted around and locked eyes with me, her face contorted with hate. "You'll pay for this, Miller," she screamed, her voice echoing in the stunned clubhouse. "I'll own your house. This isn't over." It was the most pathetic, impotent threat I had ever heard. It was over. She just didn't know it yet. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The community, finally liberated from its tyrant, began to heal. A new HOA board was elected, led by George, the retired teacher. Their first official act was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the community and to strike every one of Carol's petty rules from the bylaws. The era of beige mailboxes and legislated lawn height was over. The legal proceedings against Carol and Frank were a slow but satisfying grind. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had provided, they had no choice but to plead guilty. The video was the star of the show in the criminal case, while Brenda's documents sealed their fate in the fraud charges. Carol was convicted on all counts. She was sentenced to 2 years in state prison for the fraud, with a further 3 years of probation for the vandalism. Frank got a lighter sentence in exchange for his full cooperation. The judge was particularly scathing in his sentencing, calling their actions a disgraceful abuse of community trust. My civil suit was resolved even more quickly. Carol's lawyer advised her to settle immediately. Her homeowner's insurance refused to cover intentional criminal acts, so she was personally liable for the full amount. The court ordered her to pay my claim in its entirety, $67,452.18. To cover the judgment, she was forced to sell her house in Maple Creek Estates, the very house from which she had terrorized her neighbors. The last I heard, she was living in a small apartment on the other side of the state, her social standing and finances completely destroyed. Poetic justice, I thought, was sometimes a dish best served with a court order. The HOA, under its new leadership, also sued Frank's company and managed to claw back a significant portion of the stolen funds. In a gesture that moved me more than I can say, the board voted to use that money to create a new community asset. They hired a landscape architect and built a beautiful community garden in the common area by the creek, complete with raised beds, a shared tool shed, and a section dedicated to native pollinators. They named it the Eleanor Miller Memorial Garden. I found myself spending almost as much time there as I did in my own backyard, helping new gardeners learn about composting and soil health. The neighborhood was transforming. People started talking to each other again. Little flourishes of personality began to appear on houses, a brightly painted front door here, a whimsical garden sculpture there. The soulless conformity of Carol's reign was being replaced by a genuine sense of community. As for my own garden, I used the settlement money to do exactly what I said I would. I hired the environmental company to remediate the soil. It was a long, slow process, but I oversaw it with the patience of a scientist. I planted cover crops of clover and rye, their roots slowly pulling the last of the chemical residues from the earth. I added tons of rich, dark compost, nursing the soil back to health, microbe by microbe. 3 years later, almost to the day, the lab results came back clean. The land was healed. I filed the paperwork, and my organic certification was officially reinstated. That spring, I planted the first tomato seedlings in the restored soil. They were Brandywine heirlooms, grown from the same seed stock Eleanor and I had saved years ago. As I gently tucked them into the clean earth, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt since before all this began. I hadn't sought this fight. I had just wanted to be left alone with my grief and my memories. But by pushing me, by threatening the one thing I had left of my wife, Carol had forced me to re-engage with the world. I had learned that sometimes, peace isn't a passive state. Sometimes, you have to fight for it. You have to stand up to the bullies, not just for yourself, but for everyone who is too afraid to. You have to be willing to draw a line in your own soil and defend it with everything you have. I looked out over my garden, thriving and vibrant once more. The bees were buzzing, the leaves were green and healthy, and the air smelled of nothing but damp earth and the promise of a bountiful harvest. My sanctuary was restored. My wife's legacy was safe. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at home.